All right. Well, it's wonderful to see everybody that is here live. I think live is the right word, live with us here this morning. There's about a dozen of us here. And we're going to talk again um, a little bit about Zen practice and in particular and spiritual practice in general being having qualities that are needed right now. How about that? Some qualities that we're seeing increasingly in our culture coming up right now in response to what's happening in our country and we're in response to what's happening in the world. And we're beginning to understand that the heart of spiritual practice, all across the world, all spiritual practice, that at the heart of it is an insistence actually upon loving response, an insistence upon wisdom, an insistence upon compassion, an insistence upon truth, an insistence upon dignity. All of our traditions insist on this because they say it over and over and over. You see it over and over and over. And increasingly, like the group that's wonderfully assembled here this morning, sitting up straight for a half an hour like we just did, calling up into conscious awareness the experience of a human body like we just did, being kindly and lovingly aware of the shifting landscape of the emotions like we just did, noticing the contents of thought, reactivity, conditioning, making conscious choices about where truth is, and that swirling and reinforcing it, where non-truth is, and that swirling and saying no. That's a fundamentally awakening. That's a fundamentally enlightening. It's a fundamentally loving activity, right? It's not, we don't have to understand that we're doing it in response to anything external to us, right? So I'm going to use words like I did last month, like resistance and defiance and rebellion, because the circumstance and the world oftentimes see this kind of activity in that sense, but we can feel in our kind of spiritual DNA, it's actually about wanting to stay connected and express something that is deeply true about what life really is. Right? It's not done as a reaction. Zazen is not done as a reaction to a world that's on fire. Zazen is done as a response to the fire within. Very different fires. Very different fires and very different motivations for why we sit. So in times like this, and increasingly we expect, what we do will be seen as, could be seen as defiance, as rebellion. It may even become dangerous at some point. That actually seems very possible, doesn't it? That seems very possible that what we're doing here today might be seen as dangerous. And so I'm going to continue talking a little bit about what we started talking about last month, but I'm just starting by reminding all of us, really all we're really wanting to do is to honor in all of us the impulse that we already have, that we're already expressing when we choose to turn toward experience with loving curiosity. Self-illumination, zazen, meditation, mindfulness, centering prayer, doesn't really matter what we call it too much. What does seem most important is that all of us can understand there is an intrinsic impulse, a spiritual, we call it a spiritual impulse. It's not really, it's the impulse. But we can call it spiritual too, I suppose that's fine. A spiritual impulse to want to wake up, understand what this life is, and respond to it in kind. And we've got many teachers, many teachers in many different traditions, both in and out of secular and sacred settings. And so we're going to listen to some of those. Today, I'm going to continue offering you my thoughts on a particular type of resistance, a particular type of soul functioning, a particular type of joyous expression that happened in the 1980s in South Africa. I'm somebody who's been fortunate enough to visit that country a number of times. It's on my mind a lot. Not only are my past experiences there on my mind a lot, but that country is on my mind a lot right now. And so we were using last month the record, the album that I discovered in 1987, like a lot of us did when it was first released. If you're into world music, the Indestructible Beat of Soweto. If you haven't heard it yet and you're watching this recording on YouTube, for God's sake, turn off this recording and go find that record. It's way more important than anything I'm about to say. But we were using that record as our jumping off point, just as a way of talking about art and expression as having intrinsic qualities that are really, really needed right now. And in keeping with my longstanding assertion that Zen practice in particular is way more art than it is craft. I appreciate we have a scientific sensibility in our culture, and I love our scientific sensibility. I absolutely affirm our scientific sensibility, and I understand why our scientific sensibility has seen in the Buddhist tradition, especially original teachings about how the mind works and how suffering is created. And when I say traditional, I mean like the early teachings from the Pali Canon, a little bit less so from Zen, although Zen spends time and Mahayana Buddhism spends time in places that contemporary science is very interested in, quantum theory especially. But when the Buddhist teachings around how mind works and how mind objectifies things and how mind relates to things and creates tension and suffering in the human animal, it made sense that our culture saw that as very scientific sounding and even called it science and even grabbed and used many of those early Buddhist teachings in therapeutic, which we consider scientific settings, right? Psychotherapy is a science. We think of that as a science. And so we use some of those early Buddhist patterns and Buddhist instructions on how consciousness works to create things like dialectical behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, and right, even mindfulness. The mindfulness movement was a secularization of teachings that we would have considered sacred or religious or spiritual, right, for the past couple of thousand years. I'm digressing. My point is, it makes a lot of sense to me that we see what we're doing as much more related to science or craft than art, and I understand that. I also affirm it. I think it's beautiful. But I also think it sells the heart, the actual heart of the tradition, especially the Zen expression of the tradition, short. The Zen expression of Buddhism spends a lot more time in the arts than it does in the sciences, and understands that artistic expression and artistic endeavor, artistic response, we can say, to the human experience is appropriate and called for, and is a vehicle for enlightenment, a vehicle for awakening, right? So that's kind of what we're riffing on. Real quick repeat of stuff, some couple things we talked about last month, just to get those of you who weren't there up to speed. We started with the Indestructible Beat of Soweto because I fell in love with this record in 1987, and it reminded me that there was something happening on the other side of the planet called apartheid that I knew nothing about, being a white guy from Minnesota, and being, especially at that time before the internet, feeling like completely cut off from the rest of the experience of the world. And in the record review that prompted me to start exploring this material, Robert Christgau, the famous Rolling Stone critic, described what he heard from these recordings coming from the poorest townships in South Africa as defiantly resilient and unsentimental exuberance. And those 4 words were the basis of this talk, because I realized defiant, saying no to what is not true, fundamental to our practice. That's what defiance is. We're not talking about objectless rebellion for the sake of rebellion. We're talking about, oh, that is not a true thing, and I have been operating under that assumption. I will no longer operate under that assumption. No, right? That's the ability to discern. I will sustain and endorse and empower the parts of me that recognize truth and narratives of truth and behaviors that are in accordance with truth, right? This is step 6 on the Eightfold Path, for those of you who know that, right? And I will also do the opposite. I will say no to, and I will stop the patterns of mind and behavior and speech that are connected to the parts of me that do not understand. This is about the ability to discern. This is the sword of wisdom, right? We defy that which is untrue and not loving, and we support that which is. Defiance. Resilience, we also talked a little bit about last month. Everybody knows what that word means. Everybody knows what that word means. Increasingly, the courage aspect of resiliency is being called for. Resilient just means, survived. You made it. You sprayed the whole lawn was sprayed with horrible insecticide to kill all the weeds, and there was a few around the edge that didn't die. They were resilient, a resilient strain, right, of a crop, or a resilient heart in the face of abuse, the kid whose spirit wasn't broken, that kind of thing, right? Resiliency, the ability to survive, the resiliency to stay alive. More so, though, in this context, we're talking about resiliency being something essential and thriving as opposed to merely surviving. And so I'm bringing up courage here because in a practice of self-reflection and self-awareness, which is what we're doing here, right? Meditation practice, Buddhist practice, Zen practice is fundamentally about just coming to know this as a vehicle of awakening, right? And understanding the human patterning and the human conditioning as being connected to suffering and wanting to bring the awakening part to the suffering part, right? Part of our compassion vow. We are seeing how the experience of courage is an experience of allowing the emotion of fear to be present. Allowing the emotion of fear to be present and continuing. Right? This is something we learn when we're kids. Right? Bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's loving action in the face of fear, in the presence of fear. And so one of the things resiliency is manifesting as right now, showing up right now as we are really experiencing a tremendous amount of fear collectively. And so one of the ways resilience shows up is I will allow that experience. I will allow myself to at least touch the experience of fear, feel the emotion of fear, understand the narrative of the fear, breathe into it and walk with it. Can you feel that's resilience? It isn't brittle resilience. I can go forward in the absence of. It's I will go forward in the face of and in the company of emotions that I find afflictive. Wow. You can feel there's power there, right? And so then today we're going to talk a little bit more about unsentimental, which is very, very, very Zen, but a really important part of what we're talking about. And then finally, some exuberance. That's a really important piece. Defiance, resilience, unsentimental, and exuberant. I'm going to read this quote from Jack Kornfield. I think I read it last month, but I couldn't remember, honestly. So I'm going to read it again because it's really important. And a lot of us know the word bodhisattva and the idea of the bodhisattvic path. If you don't, in short, it just means I practice, and then the practice that I do is on behalf of all beings everywhere. So the practice isn't personal. Our meditation practice isn't personal in the sense it is personal, the expression of it. But the spirit of it is I'm doing this because I realize I am part of a web of life. I am part of an interconnected field of beings. And on behalf of all beings everywhere, I do this. Right? It's the reason you put like the organic raspberries in your cart instead of the other raspberries. Yeah, it's going to benefit you, but you realize that decision is based on, right, a web of interconnectedness. Like, oh my God, this affects the farmer, this affects the crops, this affects the earth. This is my way of saying no to that chemical being put in the ground, that kind of thing. When you just realize, oh, it's about way, way, way more than just me. So it's a way that Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattvic path, the Bodhisattvic vow is unique to Mahayana Buddhism, or at least this expression of it. And it's just a way of saying, yeah, the project is, it's one of the ways we deal with the issues of ego, is to understand I am way, way, way more than just a separate ego being, and how I personally benefit is part of the equation always, but it isn't the entirety of the equation. And so this is part of how Mahayana Buddhism deals with the existence of the illusion of the separate self. That sounded really heady, but I trust you get what I'm saying. The Bodhisattvic path. I practice on behalf of all beings. So our friend Jack Kornfield, who is not a Mahayana Buddhist all the way, but he's become kind of a pan-Buddhist, and I've got a lot of respect for him. The Bodhisattva path is one of the most radical and powerful of all forms of Buddhist practice. It's radical because it says that our highest happiness is directly connected with the well-being of others. I'm going to stop there for just a second and go, God, I completely agree with that sentence. It's just interesting. Our highest happiness, our highest joy, our highest good is connected to the well-being of others. You wouldn't think that would be a radical assertion, would you? And yet in the realm of the ego, in the realm of the world that we wake up to every morning and read about in the headlines, that's a radical act. I just think it's an interesting moment here for us to all see kind of the difference between regular operating procedure, where most culture, most systems, most of us operate most of the time, and you kind of feel there's a big jump up to actually what's good for me and what's good for you are not two different things. It's a titanic shift, even though in a spiritual setting we think it's a duh. It's like, of course that's true. Right? We all do better when we all do better. It's like, that's not complicated. And yet I hope you can feel in your own body, in your own self, the shift in gravity there when you operate from one of those places versus the other. Oh, getting distracted again. The Bodhisattva path is one of the most radical and powerful of all forms of Buddhist practice. It's radical because it says that our highest happiness is directly connected with the well-being of others. And quieting the mind is also a radically political act. The world does not need more of anything, but it does need less. Less greed, less hatred, less ignorance. Through our meditation, we learn to transform our greed and our hate and our delusion, and we make our hearts places of serenity, integrity, and peace. And when we carry that into the suffering world, we offer genuine change. So I hope that makes sense. I hope what I've said so far has a thread in it. I hesitate to use, I love what he said there. I'm just hesitating to use the words political or resilience. I'm not hesitant to use the word resilient. I'm hesitant to use the word political and rebellion. I think it is both of those things, 100%. What I'm scared of is the part of me that I trust we all share that says, I did what I needed to do today to change the world because I sat still for 20 minutes. And I think that's also true. And I also think it's up to me to drop into a very wise place of knowing in my heart and ask myself who I am accountable to. All of us I'm accountable to, and what my participation is required to look like. And when I say required, I mean between me and me. So sometimes 20 minutes of sitting still is exactly the medicine. And that's exactly enough. In fact, it's complete and more than enough. And there are other times in my own experience where that's the place that I want to start, and that's the place I want to maybe end my day. But in between those two bookends, maybe I'm called to do something else. So I'm just cautious of the part of me that's my ego, right? That's always looking for a recipe, right? For its own value, a recipe for its own enoughness, right? And is always very sneakily looking for a way to get around the thing that it's scared of seeing, or the thing it's scared of feeling, or the thing it's scared of doing. I hope that makes sense. So, unsentimental, I'll speak to really quickly. Unsentimental to me is increasingly beginning to mean empathic, connected, compassionate, and without the personal sugar, the personal, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, when something is kind of treacly or just too saccharine, or you can feel that there's an attachment, there's another kind of agenda being met. When I am sentimental and I'm attached to something, I can see how those two things lead me to generate my own suffering, because it's kind of like going through all your books and saying, hey, time to go to the bookstore. We got to get rid of all of our books. We got to spring cleaning, got to go through the old books, got to go through the clothes, got to go through the drawers. Let's get rid of some stuff. That part of me that won't quite let something go, because of an attachment that doesn't quite feel right. There's some part of there's a belief being sustained about being a good person, or hanging on to something being a sign of loyalty, or I don't know, I'm just riffing here, but you kind of get it, right? When there's a sense of sentimentality that is purporting to be something lofty like love or devotion, but is actually, there's some part of me that I can feel I'm actually motivated by fear, and I'm actually motivated by attachment, and I'm actually motivated by something I can actually feel is limiting in some way, right? This isn't about getting rid of books. Well, heaven forfend. I never want to get rid of books. I'm just using that as my example. Sentimental attachment. Sentimental essentially just in this context means self-serving. That's what I could have just said. It just means self-serving, as opposed to, oh, appreciation of the beauty of the flower. Oh, it's so beautiful. Wow, I love that. Sentimental be like, oh, sentimental. I'm gonna pick it. It's mine. I want it. Self-serving. That's kind of the difference here. And the offering, I mean, the reason this fit into the music review is because the way Chris Gauss saw the music being offered in this setting, on these recordings from all those years ago, was it's a communal expression on behalf of a community. It's just offered out without boundaries, right? It's offered out without boundaries. Anybody can join in and anybody can listen to it. So it doesn't have that self limitation. There isn't a sense of it being limited, and there isn't a sense of it being exclusive. That seems important, right? And we all have this part of ourselves that wants to say that thing is members only, right? Finally, why does that matter right now? It matters right now because members only is getting really important, getting really big. You can feel it, right? Who's in the club and who's not in the club? Because we're trying to get rid of people who are not in the club. And that always is a fear response. That's always a fear response. And I'm going to use my Raksu as an example. A lot of you know what a Raksu is, just a small version of the traditional Buddhist robe. You can see the rectangle there, the traditional Buddhist robe. In Zen, we have these small versions for informal settings like today. We wear around the neck on a strap. Chinese invention, according to the myth. And there were times when my teacher would call me out in private, always, and kindly with love, always. But you're being very, very precious about the things of practice, the symbols, the robes, the clothes, the bows. There's something precious about what's happening. Not precious in of great value, but precious like I can see that you are using them to strengthen the sense of self. It's becoming a members only club. Don't do that, please. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Like we're in, I'm in, you're out. And we see this in religious community, of course, but we see this in political community. We see this in sports communities. We see this in family communities. Things become sentimental and they become attached, and then it becomes a way of dividing instead of including. And so if what's true about the legend of how this thing was invented, it came during a time of my memory, what I was told, it came during a time of great oppression when the world was getting smaller and smaller and smaller to try to unify China, and to try to unify all the different states under one leadership structure. And so part of how you unify a nation is by getting rid of the non-Chinese, in that case, elements. Because this is the thing we're going to unify around. It sounds like what's happening in our country today. We're going to decide what America is, and then we're going to get rid of the stuff that we decide isn't America, right? And so during that time, the temples were being burned and monks and nuns were being murdered and people being killed because we're getting rid of Buddhism, because Buddhism isn't Chinese. Buddhism's from India. We're getting rid of that, right? So in order to keep the tradition of the rice fields and its symbol of interconnectedness and its symbol of life and its symbol of the exuberance and irrepressibility of consciousness itself in the form of life. That's what it symbolizes, the non-separateness of the field of life, ignorance, enlightenment, bliss, suffering, the irrepressibility of life in the rice field, right? The thing that sustains everybody, the symbol of that which just rises up from the earth, the living thing that sustains everything. Keeping that symbol alive is really, really important. And yet wearing the robe out in public would have meant death, or at least terrible consequences. And so the invention of a very small version like this that could be worn around the neck underneath the clothing, so it's private, becomes a way of keeping the sewing tradition alive, and it becomes a way of keeping the tradition of Zen alive. This is a symbol of the Buddhist tradition, the Zen tradition in particular, alive. More importantly, it becomes that is a defiance, right? We're going to keep this thing alive. We're going to keep it secret. And so after the period of oppression is done, now you can bring it back out again. You can wear it in public. Chinese culture can embrace Buddhism as its own. We're back to being able to express things. And so now it's worn on the outside of the clothes. But I hope what you can hear in that is, of course, there's defiance there. Of course, there's the irrepressibility of truth in that, but there's an exuberance. This is the thing that happens on your lawn after you mow it. The thing keeps showing up. Life keeps lifing. The nation is destroyed. Mountains and rivers remain. The foundation keeps showing up. So every time you sit, every time you make with your body the shape of your awakening, the shape of Buddha, you sit up straight, a straight spine. You notice the feeling. You notice the anger. You befriend the fear, the fury. You make a safe space in your heart for all of those things. It's a transformative agent in a world that desperately needs it. But most importantly, it's exactly what the core of your being needs. You can act in the world from a place that's deeply grounded in who and what you actually are, which is awakening itself. It's an affirmation of the entire tradition. If our current culture sees that as a rebellion, that's on them. It's actually a beautiful submission of the scaredest parts of us to the parts of us that are the most grounded in truth. What a thing it is that you do when you sit. What a thing that is. What power, right? And so you are called to be this way. Your practice is called to be this way because you're a human being. You're called to remember that before you grew into understanding that you're a separate being and you are vulnerable, before that, you knew better. You didn't know you knew better, but you knew better. You knew that you were not separate and therefore indestructible. No birth, no death. Right? And so the defiantly resilient, as he said, an unsentimental exuberance of your own practice is fundamental. You don't need to cultivate these qualities. You don't need to find them. They are already there. They are already what and who you most truly are. A spiritual being having a human experience fraught with suffering, fraught with delusion, fraught with the illusion of separation, fraught with grasping, fraught. We all know that. But sitting down and sitting up straight can be a remembrance, right? Wow, And the qualities that I've clumsily tried to connect to my beautiful tradition are qualities we all understand. Yes, I already am those things, but in order to integrate them into my life, I have to absorb them more fully into my day-to-day experience. So every time you sit, every time you pay attention, every time you do your journaling practice, every time you see a therapist, every time you do mindfulness, every time you go for a walk, every time you slow down, every time you put your phone away, whatever that thing is you resolve to face makes a difference. So that's as much as I think I need to say. I could go on and on and on and on and on. But I appreciate your attention. I appreciate the part of you that's, trying to grab something from what I'm offering. And what I hope most of all isn't that you hear anything that's important or helpful in my words so much as the process of what we're doing right now. Me talking to you and listening helps you to connect to the part of yourself that goes, oh yes, I know that. I've always known that. I know that. I've always known that. I know that I've always known that. I will come home again. Who I am. That's what I hope. So thank you, as always, for your attention. And see ya. See you next time. So, my friends,